In the second, we'll go through an overview of virtualization, first with vSphere, and explain what vSphere is. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the third-party virtualization technologies that are out there, as well as some other virtualization technologies available from VMware. In the third, we're going to cover everything about ESXi, from the planning process all the way to and through installation. In Chapter 4, we'll cover tools that can be used in your VMware environment. In that chapter, we'll cover specific tools that are included with the vSphere environment, both vCenter and ESXi, and some popular third-party tools. In Chapter 5, we'll talk about vCenter Server 6.5 and licensing. vCenter Server being our centralized top-down management server. And we'll cover licensing not only from the VMware world, but also some Microsoft licensing. In Chapter 6, we get into one of the two foundational topics, which is configuring networking and how it works in a virtual environment compared to physical. In Chapter 7, we get into storage, how all the storage applies in a virtual environment. We look at everything from the host perspective. In Chapter 8, we'll get into everything you wanted to know about VMs but were afraid to ask. The title couldn't possibly cover all the things we've gotten there, so we'll get into all the details of virtual machines, turning your physical servers into virtual machines. In Chapter 9, we'll talk about security and some of the new enhancements in the latest versions, as well as permissions. In Chapter 10, we're going to cover server and VM monitoring, how best to monitor your environment. We'll talk about alarms and log files and all of that in there, as well as detail on the resources that are important to the environment, like CPU and memory. In Chapter 11, we go through advanced. These are all the bells and whistles. A lot of these depend on what your licensing is, what you've purchased or are entitled to, such as DRS and storage DRS and vMotion and storage vMotion and things like that. In Chapter 12, we'll cover patching, and once we finish patching, we'll cover advanced upgrading through Centralized Update Manager. In Chapter 13, we'll cover disaster recovery and one more of the cluster technologies called high availability, and a new technology called fault-tolerant VMs, and then we'll briefly touch on backups.